Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me here today, and thanks to the Scottish Drugs Forum. My name is Nina Vaswani. I'm a research fellow at the Centre for Youth and Criminal Justice. So please bear with me today. I have a very sore throat and a bit of a cough, so I don't know if I can even talk for 30 minutes, but I'll give it my best shot. So it's great to see gender on the agenda, if you will. You hear a lot about gender-informed practice nowadays, and it's really important that we are responsive and aware of gender issues in our practice. So I'm a bit gutted that Carol Deary can't be here today. I've heard Carol speak a number of times and she's absolutely brilliant. But I set this up as a little bit of a counterpart to Carol's presentation, and obviously she's not here, which is a bit gutting, but a bit of a relief as well, because she can totally wipe the floor with me. So I'm now free to just rant on about what I want to rant on about. So let's go back to basics. Gender. The Oxford English Dictionary definition of gender is the state of being male or female. And there have been a number of gender-focused events, as I said, people are becoming much more aware of this. There's a number of gender-focused events about gender and justice, which is my interest. There was the Which Way Now? New Directions in Evidence-Based and Gender-Informed Practice by the RMA. There was the Gender, Crime and Justice event by SATO. There was a Gender and Justice Day event at the University of Leicester. So as you can see, gender is becoming a big issue. People are becoming much more aware of it. But actually, when you scratch the surface of those gender events, what you find is actually the vast majority of inputs and presentations at these events were actually about females. They weren't about gender as such, they were specifically about females. So I'm not for a minute dismissing the considerable and terrible issues that girls and women at home and abroad face, and often at the hands of males. So sexual exploitation, domestic violence, sexual assault, discrimination, among many others. And we heard in the news last week that violent crimes against females are at a record high in England and Wales. So this reminds us that many of these issues are not yet consigned to history. And I think, as Carol probably would have talked about, our justice system is filled predominantly with young men, and thus the justice system tends to be designed around what are perceived to be males' needs and males' issues. And so our justice system may not work for the small number of females that end up in it. But I am really concerned that when we simply equate gender with females and not in fact gender, then we are only considering half of the issue. And we run the risk of forgetting about males. Just because the system isn't working for females doesn't mean it is working for males. And given that males are blamed for many of society's ills, it seems to me that we need more than ever to renew our efforts about getting it right for our young males who will go on to be society's men in a few short years. So I've set out my stall, you know where I'm coming from. In this presentation, I am going to highlight some of the vulnerabilities we have witnessed in young men involved in the justice system, particularly in relation to trauma, bereavement and loss in their childhoods. So although this is about bereavement and loss, it could probably actually be about ACEs. You'll see a lot of parallels between what I'm going to talk about and what Jenny and James presented earlier. But what I'm also going to do is try and highlight how being of male gender may even exacerbate some of these vulnerabilities. So my interest in bereavement and loss in young people stems from about 2006. I was working at Glasgow City Council at the time, and we were charged with reducing our persistent offender population, as all local authorities were at the time. So in Glasgow, that was a considerable challenge. We had 252 persistent offenders at that time. And I sat as a research officer and trawled through the case files of every single one of those 252 young people, just so we could get a better understanding of their needs, so we could try and meet those needs better and reduce offending in the population. And what became clear to me was that bereavement had occurred time and time and time again. So I undertook a bit more of a focused study on these 252 young people. And what I found actually was that the prevalence of bereavement didn't really differ from the general adolescent population. So I found that 59% of these young people, so these were young people aged 8 to 15, so 59% had been bereaved. And we find in the general adolescent population that this is, in school children, this is usually between about 43 and 78%. So our group of young people was no different to the general population. But what I did find was that the nature of that bereavement was remarkably different. So the rate of multiple bereavements was high. So these young people weren't even 16 yet, and a small number had experienced 5 or more bereavements. The rate of traumatic death was high, so death caused by murder, by suicide, by overdose. This was a really common feature in these young people's backgrounds. And the rate of parental death. We talked about parental loss in relation to the ACEs, but parental death was particularly high in this population. So in the adolescent population, the rate of parental death is quite consistently in a whole range of studies between about 3 and 5%, and it was nearly 20% in our population. Okay. When you look at young people in prison, these findings are simply amplified. So I looked at a survey of 33 young men in Polmont Young Offenders Institution, and what I found was that 91% of these young men had been bereaved. And these were young men who hadn't yet reached the age of 21. 97% of these young men had experienced multiple bereavements. So they hadn't experienced just one bereavement on average, or 2, or 3, or 4, or even 5. But actually these young men had experienced 5.4 bereavements on average each. And these young men, most of them were still teenagers. And actually in that small sample of 33 young men, they had experienced a total of 162 bereavements. One young man had experienced 18, and he was only 19. So it's not surprising to find that 2/3 of the young men in Polmont that I surveyed had experienced what is termed a substantial number of bereavements. So this is 4 or more bereavements. And it's at this point, I think, where we start to see the likelihood of complications with the bereavement response. And we'll come back to that later, but that's quite an important figure. What really struck me as well was that more than 3/4 of the population had experienced at least one traumatic bereavement. So as I said, bereavement through murder, through suicide, through overdose, through things like that. So this quote really typifies the experience that we saw in Polmont. So I will read them out to you. I can't do a Glaswegian accent despite living in the city for a couple of decades. I was thinking about, how many more people do I have to see die? Am I going to grow up and see everybody die off? Know what I mean? That was the way I kind of felt. I'm only 19, and that's 5 people died already. And I keep thinking to myself, are the rest of them going to die? Know what I mean? Then I'll grow up alone. So this was a really, really common experience among that population in Polmont. But it's not just about bereavement. While the concept of loss is frequently applied to bereaved individuals, the majority of losses in society do not arise as a result of death. So another study in Polmont Young Offenders Institution looked at 23 young men's journeys to that institution. And this wasn't a study that was actually even looking at loss or bereavement. It was a study that my colleague at the centre was undertaking. But I came to the data with a bit of a loss perspective and had a look, and their narratives, the young men's narratives, revealed 4 broad categories of loss that ran through their lives, from their childhoods right through to the present day. And this is where I think we really see the parallels with the ACEs. So the first loss was loss of relationships. So there was separation from family throughout their childhood, through family breakdown, through being taken into care. But there was also the loss of relationships as a result of being imprisoned. There was loss of status. So young men in prison had lost their liberty. They had lost autonomy through being in prison. They were not able to even make the most basic decisions about their daily lives. They also had a loss of status throughout their childhood as a result of labels. So as a result of being a young offender, or a young in care, or indeed a prisoner. There was a loss of stability in these young people's lives. So the narratives really described a childhood full of chaos. So multiple house moves, multiple placement moves, multiple school moves, abuse, neglect. These were experiences that many of these young men had experienced. But the most common one that the young people that I met described was the loss of future. So the loss of their future self, the loss of their hopes, dreams, and ambitions. So the reality of having a criminal record, or the stigma of being in care. So some of these losses can be quite ambiguous. Temporary separation, the death of an abusive parent, or some of these losses might be quite small. But these losses that contain an element of ambiguity can also be particularly problematic, even though they do seem small on the surface. Loss through bereavement is, by virtue of its permanence, the ultimate loss. However, while death is final, It is a universal experience, and therefore it is acknowledged in all cultures and frequently accompanied by rituals and social support for the bereaved. This universality can mean that bereavement doesn't really have that much stigma attached to it, but being in care or having a parent imprisoned can have quite a lot of stigma attached to it as well, which can make the response to that more complicated. So as I said, ambiguous losses may often be small, but they can have a cumulative effect. And also these losses that maybe are less well recognised by society don't result in the same levels of understanding or support from professionals or from society. So ambiguous losses can therefore result in what has been termed disenfranchised grief, which is when losses are not publicly mourned or socially supported. So young people and prisoners are often disenfranchised by their age and status. Are you allowed to mourn your loss of liberty and future if you committed a serious crime, or is that the just deserts that you deserve? What if you caused the death of the person you are grieving for? Or what if you were too young to fully understand the death of your parent? Are you supported to grieve and mourn in an age-appropriate way? So these quotes from the young men really typify the sort of range of losses that young people have experienced, and some of them may not be that obvious. So my daughter dying and my brother dying, my sister getting raped, being in care my whole life, just lots of stuff, my mental health. This young man talked about the loss of his mother, even though she wasn't, she was there, but she was lost to him. Obviously, my father's been in prison for nearly 5 years, and I've got nobody to follow by, no role model, so I had nobody. I've got a mum, but I don't class her as a mum, because I don't feel like I've had a mum. So what is the impact of loss and bereavement on behaviour? So young men reported feeling sad, feeling shock, feeling angry, feeling numb, and these are all really common reactions to loss. So typical reactions to loss and trauma are wide-ranging and include physical symptoms such as headaches, stomach aches, loss of appetite, or sleep problems, and also emotional reactions such as anxiety, grief, self-blame, rumination, or numbness. And young people are remarkably resilient, and these symptoms often subside over a few months. But sometimes even the most common reactions can be misinterpreted as poor behaviour. So if a young person is angry or irritable, for example, how is that behaviour interpreted? But in more problematic scenarios, these emotions and natural stress responses can manifest as challenging behaviours. So in a problematic scenario, there can be an increase in substance misuse, an increase in risk-taking behaviour, which is where we often see the offending behaviour come in, an increase in risky sexual behaviour, and an increase in self-harm and suicide. So I'm coming from a justice perspective. It's really quite easy to see how these types of behaviours can lead to young people getting entangled with the law and having contact with the justice system. And this is especially important when we're thinking about young men. Young males are more likely to externalise and act out their frustrations and emotions than young females. And certainly the young men I spoke to in Pullman often viewed bereavements as the trigger for a downward spiral in their behaviour, an increase in their substance misuse, and at times they directly attributed their entry into prison to a specific bereavement in their lives. So again, here are some quotes from the young men. I just didn't bother with anything, even the police, they didn't scare me, they didn't bother me anymore. Or, I'd no been in prison before, but after my gran died, everything got worse just from there. I just started drinking a lot more, and I drink every day now, basically. The more I drank, the more I wouldn't think of him, basically. Not to forget about him, but to forget about that, so to forget about his bereavement. The good things you obviously remember, and then the bad things kind of take over. Or when my granddad passed away, any time I was feeling low about it, I used to smoke a lot of cannabis. And then I found my stepdad dead. After that, I just started using different drugs, like cocaine and ecstasy and stuff. So that was basically my way of dealing with it all. And I think almost every young man I spoke to in Pullman used substances as self-medication for dealing with the traumas that they had experienced in their lives. So very much I agree with, it's not what's wrong with you, it's what's happened to you. These behaviours don't come out of nowhere. So as I said, young people are remarkably resilient, but some situations might be more likely to loss and bereavement responses becoming problematic. So the high rates of traumatic and multiple bereavements that we see in this vulnerable population are really concerning because these are associated with more complicated grief responses, an increased risk of depression, reduced self-esteem, and as I'd said earlier, an increase in risk-taking behaviour. The high levels of ambiguous loss and disenfranchised grief also complicate the grieving response. So Pauline Boss, who coined the term ambiguous loss, states that this type of loss is inherently traumatic because the inability to resolve the situation causes pain, confusion, shock, distress, and often immobilisation. Without closure, the trauma of this unique kind of loss becomes chronic. So chronic trauma and isolation can lead young men to deal with things as best as they can. Unfortunately, many vulnerable young people have poor coping strategies and suffer from a real lack of positive social support and do not get the help they need. So these experiences can affect males and females. These adverse childhood experiences, this loss and bereavement, that's not specific to young men. That affects both males and females. But there are particular issues here that mean that young males are especially vulnerable to not getting the help they need and therefore having a more complicated response. So what is the gender gap in help seeking? I was really interested to hear about Felicity and Lindsay's research that actually the young females who are asking questions on their website outnumbered males 3 to 1. And I think that is really, really common experience that we see with young men in this society. So a study in Queensland found that 30% of young men said they would not seek help from anyone regarding personal, emotional or distressing problems. Only 6% of females said the same. Another study found that men report higher levels of substance misuse and are more likely to have experienced psychosocial problems as a result of that substance use, but they are significantly less likely than females to seek help for this substance misuse. So it's common knowledge, particularly in the west of Scotland, I think that males are quite reluctant to seek help for their health symptoms until quite a late stage. But I think what was concerning for me was that a study of 1,000 school children in Devon found that even for common adolescent problems, for really basic things, falling out with your friends, being worried about schoolwork, having an argument with your parents, males were significantly less likely for every issue to ask for help than females were. And even when young males do seek help, they do so at a much later stage than young women, often only at crisis point, which opens them up to prolonged pain and suffering. So we hear from these young men themselves. I tried putting a brave face on for my mum and that, and at the time it felt good, but after the visit I went up to the cell. When you're on remand, you're stuck in all day and just worrying. And this young man talks about the role models in his life. I mean, I've never seen my dad cry. When my granddad died, I didn't see him greet. When my gran died, I didn't see him greet. I suppose I've just always held myself back as well, rather than talk about things. Again, these young men really didn't understand the emotions they were feeling, and I want to come back to that in a minute. I couldn't talk to anyone. I couldn't open up. If I was angry, I would just explode, start smashing things up, start fighting with people. Or I felt a lot of things I hadn't felt before, and I didn't know how to deal with them, so I just didn't deal with them. I forgot about them. And one young man, he just simply said, I didn't even know what grieving was. So why are males vulnerable to reduced help seeking? There's a whole range of theories here, and I don't have time or even the knowledge really to go into all of these in a great deal of detail, but gender role conflict is a key theory. So gender roles are defined as the behaviours and attitudes that we acquire from the culture in which we live that influence how men and women should act in daily life. And gender role conflict occurs when male gender socialisation affects men's willingness or their ability to seek help for problems. So there are a number of components to this. It could be that there is more of an orientation towards success, power and competition among males, or there's conflicts between work and family, or restrictive, affectionate behaviour between males. And certainly in the Polmont environment, it's such a hyper-masculine environment. These factors were clearly intensified, and there was real evidence of a macho culture. So young men putting on a front to maintain their reputation, a real fear of being seen as even the slightest bit vulnerable, and that was from their peers, but also from the staff. And a very real lack of positive male role models in these young men's lives. Social psychology also attempts to explain this gender gap in help seeking. There's a whole range of factors that influence help seeking. Again, I'm not going to go through them all, but the one for me, I think that was especially pertinent for trauma, bereavement and loss in this population is the normativeness of the problem. So this is where people are less likely to seek help for problems that they do not perceive to be common or normal. And it was surprising how many of the young men thought they were the only ones struggling with a multitude of traumas. I guess if we as a society don't talk about death very openly and don't talk about trauma, we maybe miss and don't acknowledge many of these more ambiguous traumas. So no wonder they feel that they are all alone. Other theories are that young men, or males in general, have lower emotional literacy than females. So emotional competence is the ability to identify, describe and manage your emotions. And if you aren't able to even identify your emotions, how can you even begin to ask for help for your issues? And we saw that on the quotes on the previous slide. A lot of the young men didn't know what it was that they were feeling, or didn't know that grieving was normal. Another theory is lack of social support. Studies have found that women have significantly larger social support networks than males. And it may be that young men simply don't have the social support, the resources from which to seek help, support, encouragement and advice. So these factors combine to mean that males are often left to deal with their loss and grief and trauma as best as they can. For many though, they have poor coping strategies, so avoidant strategies were very, very common. Let's not think about this, let's bury this, let's drown this in substances. So most young men had what were avoidant strategies. As I mentioned, males tend to be far more likely to act out rather than internalise their emotions, and hence their struggles and vulnerabilities from a really early age are often misinterpreted as bad behaviour, right back to the classroom. So this leads to increased contact with authority and the justice system, and often the start of a negative cycle of behaviour and system interventions. And each increase in risk-taking, acting out behaviour and system intervention increases the likelihood of additional traumas. So being involved in violence increases the likelihood of trauma. Being involved in criminal justice increases the likelihood of being imprisoned and the traumas that are associated with that. Being in prison disrupts coping strategies further. So the positive coping strategies that we employ, such as going for a walk or visiting a graveside, as well as strategies that might not be as adaptive, but they provide at least temporary, even important relief. So having a drink, getting drunk, actually that might not be that useful, but it does provide you with some relief in the short term. These males in prison didn't have access to any of that and were left really struggling with their grief. So young men, and young men in prison in particular, are especially vulnerable to poor outcomes in relation to trauma, bereavement and loss. So as I said, self-medication was really, really common feature. So this quote, I think, highlights what we talked about normativeness, and I think it came up in one of the earlier presentations about young people realising that they aren't alone. So this was a young man who had agreed to go along to a loss and grief education programme in the prison. I'm not quite sure what made him sign up, but actually he found that experience really positive. So going to that group, I realised I wasn't the only one that had bad things happen to them in their life. And that's being honest with you. Because I thought generally only the bad things were happening to me. Ken what I mean? And that's why I was the way I was, eh? But just listening to other people tell me what happened to their family and that, I was like, it was really like eye-opening. You'd never think that. So this was really a revelation of realising they were not alone. Okay. So where does this leave young men today? Oh, hang on. Sorry. I'll go back. So what can we conclude? I think the high levels of traumatic and multiple bereavements and the range of losses and adverse childhood experiences that we see in this vulnerable population are really, really concerning. These affect both males and females, but young men have reduced help seeking due to these societal and cultural norms, and also to a lack of social support. So this leaves young men with poor coping strategies, leaves young men with unresolved grief, it leaves them in pain and distress, and as I said, it leaves them acting out on challenging behaviour that we so often misinterpret as bad behaviour. And what do? We punish, we imprison, and these create additional losses. We remove people from their supports, we place them in the most challenging environment in which to show even the slightest hint of vulnerability. We disrupt their coping strategies, and we generally just make things worse. So of course some young people have committed serious crimes, and prison may be the only option at that point. But we must never forget that this challenging behaviour often starts as a young child expressing the pain and trauma of loss, bereavement and adversity in the only way that they know how. So where does this leave young men today? Well, hazardous alcohol use is implicated in the death of 1/3 of young men aged under 29 in the developed world. Self-injury and self-harm among young males has doubled since the 1980s, and this doesn't include self-injury and self-harm through getting involved in fights and violence. It's just a more traditional self-harm that we would expect there. Mental illness is more common among males, and the prognosis is actually often poorer in relation to a number of illnesses. We have a problem with violence. So more than 95% of the Scottish prison population is male, and 91% of those people in Scotland who are accused of murder are male. But actually 76% of those murdered in Scotland are also male. And suicide is a leading cause of death in young men aged 20 to 49 in this country. And there were some researchers in Switzerland called Angst and Ernst, which I always quite liked the name, but I think they really sum this up by saying that women seek help and men die. And this was from a study that found that 75% of people seeking help from a suicide prevention centre were female, and 75% of suicides at the same time were male. I think that really, really highlights the issues with help seeking. So what can we do about it? I don't have all of the answers. I probably don't even have any of the answers, I have to say. Where do you want to start is that these losses, these bereavements, these traumas that we see in young people in the justice system, these losses happened so much earlier in childhood. And I think it's really important that we as a society and as an education system really look at universal grief and death education for every single person in this country. At some point, every person will be bereaved, and even if in school a young person isn't, they will have peers that are going through this. And as a society, we need to be so much better at dealing with this. We need to raise awareness, and that's why I was so pleased to come along today, and I'm so pleased to hear about all the work that's happening about the ACEs. We need to be able to identify and respond to bereavement, but also these more ambiguous losses, these small traumas that actually might have a really big impact on a young person. We need to understand young people's behaviour better and where this behaviour is coming from. Some young people will need specialist support. Services across Scotland for this type of experience are patchy, but the provision is improving and is getting better every year. We need to address this gender gap in help seeking. So help seeking is a learned behaviour. This gender gap that I've talked about, that doesn't even appear until age 3. There's no gender gap in help seeking under the age of 3. So it is a learned behaviour. It is about society. It is about parents. It is about role modelling and educating people about supporting help seeking behaviours in all young people, but young men especially. We need to ensure that our services are responsive to males. So the young men that I spoke to, they hadn't really sought any supports for their losses and their bereavements. They were very clear that they didn't want to talk about these things. These things were too difficult. They didn't want to talk about their emotions. But actually, chatting to me in the research, quite a lot of the young men after said, thank you, do you know what, I've never talked about that before, and I quite enjoyed that. And it was very much about sort of storytelling and narratives rather than necessarily getting to the bottom of the emotions that they were feeling. But certainly some young men seemed to benefit from that. Other things suggest, for example, young males would actually rather a female service provider for therapeutic or other support functions. They don't want to appear vulnerable in front of other males. But the young men that we spoke to did indicate that a male mentor for leadership or activities would actually be very, very valuable, so a really positive male role model. I think we really need to make sure that we don't make things worse. So the way the system responds to young people often does, so residential care, secure care, custody, we need to use these as a last resort. They disrupt coping strategies in people who have poor coping strategies to begin with, and they create additional traumas and losses. But we do need to use these, we need to use residential care, we do need to use prison on occasion. So we need to look at how we minimise the impact of these institutions on how people deal with trauma, loss and bereavement. So these quotes sum up two men's experiences of attending funerals from Polmont. Attending a funeral was really, really important for the young men. It was the only place in which they felt it was socially acceptable to be vulnerable, and because everybody else was expressing their emotions at the same time. But doing this from prison can be a very, very challenging experience. So I had a cuff on, which is like the big long chain, plus I had 2 handcuffs on, so I was like triple cuffed. And I was saying, can you not take one off so I can give people a hug? Because people were hugging me and I just had to lean into them. It was so horrible, man. And this was a young man attending his funeral of his mother. I was sad. That was the only time I ever cried over her at the funeral. I think that's when I came to reality that she wouldn't be coming back and everybody else was greeting. But just to finish, it's not all doom and gloom. There are lots of positive developments happening in Scotland at the moment. So I think these adverse childhood experiences are really becoming a hot topic, and that's really, really positive that we're increasing our knowledge and understanding of these issues. At the Centre for Youth and Criminal Justice in November, we're actually having a conference to raise awareness and discuss practice issues in relation to loss, bereavement and trauma. And this is aimed at everybody who works with young people. It's not about specialist service provision. It's about what everybody can do to have some of those conversations or to start some of that support. So if you're interested in that, then get in touch with me after this and I can pass on the details. The Scottish Government and the Big Lottery Fund have in recent years provided quite a considerable amount of funding to develop and increase bereavement supports for children across Scotland. So there's a number of new services in Glasgow and across Scotland that have started up in the last 12 months. Polmont, I have to say, it has been really brilliant to work with them. They have really taken the research and made some substantial developments in the institution. They have trained around 500 staff. They've raised awareness about loss, bereavement and trauma there. They've put in new services. And we are beginning to see that this is beginning to have an impact on the young men. So just to finish with a couple of quotes from the young men who have been going through this new provision at Polmont. I've never been able to open up and express myself at all and express my feelings in that. I've never been able to do it for all my life. And just doing that was like weight was falling off my shoulders, ken what I mean? It felt like I had a weight bar with about 4 ton on it, trying to lift it every day. But see, every time I was letting it out, it felt like that bar, the weights were just falling off it. Another young man, I've started to act totally differently since I've got it all rest. I think I was maybe a bit angrier, and that before I'd actually spoke about it all, I think that was probably what had led to me being in here as well. So these young men are really highlighting some of the positive impact of the work that's going on in Polmont. But I just want to leave you to say we shouldn't be leaving it till a young man is in prison before we start addressing their trauma, bereavement and loss. It's really important that we have these conversations with children and young people to ask the difficult questions. It's not easy, and many people lack the confidence or the skills to talk about death, bereavement and trauma. And people may be dealing with their own experiences too. But we owe it to our young people as professionals, and especially as a society, to be brave enough to have those conversations. So that's me. I think I've gone on for way over time. I lost the track. There are a number of reports that are published in relation to this. So the original persistent offender profile that I talked about, it's available. They're all available on the Centre for Youth and Criminal Justice website. Some of them are quite summary reports of the bigger research reports as well, so they're quite accessible. And there's a lot more information on this topic on our website. You can also follow us on Twitter or subscribe to our mailing list. And my email address is at the bottom there. So if anybody does want to know more about this or to know more about our conference that we're having, then feel free to get in touch.